Today we're going to read Anne of Green Gables, and this is by L.M. Montgomery. Here it goes, Chapter 1, Beginnings. It was a sunny afternoon in June. Mrs. Lynde looked out her kitchen window and saw Matthew Cuthbert drive by in a horse and buggy. "Where is Matthew Cuthbert going?" wondered Mrs. Lynde. "And why is he wearing his best suit? He never goes visiting. He's much too quiet and shy." Mrs. Lindy liked to know what everyone in Avonlea was doing. Matthew lived at Green Gables with his sister Marilla, so Mrs. Lindy decided to walk over to Green Gables. When Mrs. Lindy got to Green Gables, she found Marilla Cuthbert in the kitchen. Marilla was a tall, thin woman with gray, streaked dark hair. It was twisted into a hard knot at the back of her head. "Good evening, Rachel," she said. "It's a fine evening, isn't it? Won't you sit down?" "I saw Matthew going off," Mrs. Lindy said. "I was afraid you're sick. I thought maybe he was going to get the doctor." "Oh no, I'm quite well. Matthew went to Bright River. We are getting a boy from the orphanage in Nova Scotia. He's coming in the train tonight." Mrs. Lindy could not believe her ears. Marilla and Matthew adopting a boy? The world was certainly turning upside down. "Are you serious about this, Marilla?" asked Mrs. Lindy. "Yes, of course," Marilla said. "Matthew is getting on in years. He isn't as strong as he once was. We decided a boy could help him on the farm." Mrs. Lindy wanted to stay until Matthew came back home with the boy, but it would be at least 2 hours before they arrived. She decided to go up the road and tell the surprising news to Mrs. Bell. "I'm sorry for that poor orphan," Mrs. Lindy said when she was back out in the lane. "Matthew and Marilla don't know anything about raising children." When Matthew Cuthbert arrived at the station, there was no sign of the train. The long platform was empty except for a guard sitting at the end. The station master was locking up the ticket office. "Will the 5:30 train be along soon?" Matthew asked. "The train's been in and gone," the station master said. "But there was a passenger for you, a little girl." "I don't understand," Matthew said. "Mrs. Spencer was supposed to send a boy, not a girl." "Well, you'd better talk to the girl," said the station master. "She's been waiting for you." The girl watched Matthew walk toward her. She was wearing a very ugly yellowish-gray dress. Beneath her faded brown sailor hat were two thick red braids. She had a small, thin, freckled face and huge gray-green eyes. "I suppose you're Matthew Cuthbert of Green Gables," the girl says. "I was afraid you weren't coming. I made up my mind that if you didn't come, I would climb in that tree over there to sleep. Don't you think it would be lovely to sleep in a tree all white with moonlight?" Matthew looked into the girl's glowing eyes. He knew he couldn't tell her there had been a mistake. He had to take her home to Green Gables. I'm sorry, I was late, he said. Come along, give me your bag. I can carry it, the girl said. It's got all my worldly goods in it, but it isn't heavy. Matthew led the girl to the horse and buggy. It's wonderful that I'm going to live with you, the girl said. Were you ever in an orphanage? It's worse than anything. There isn't much scope for imagination in an orphanage, believe me. The girl talked all the way back to Avonlea. Matthew didn't mind. He found that he liked this lovely little girl. They drove up a hill and rounded a corner. The girl pointed to one of the farms along a slope beyond the valley below. That's Green Gables, isn't it? She asked. Well, you have guessed it, Matthew said. The girl sighed happily. I was afraid it was only a dream, but it's real. We are nearly home. Chapter 2 The Mistake. When they reached Green Gables, Marilla came forward as Matthew opened the door. When she saw the girl, she stopped in surprise. Matthew Cuthbert, who is that? She asked. Where's the boy? There isn't any boy, Matthew said. There was only her. She nodded at the girl. But we sent word to Mrs. Spencer to send a boy, Marilla said. Well, she sent a girl. I had to bring her home. I couldn't leave her at the station. You don't want me? The girl cried out. I might have known. It was too beautiful to last. I should have known nobody would want me. She sat down at the kitchen table and began to cry. Well, there's no need to cry about it, Marilla said. Yes, there is need, the girl sobbed. She raised her tear-stained face and looked at Marilla. This is the most tragical thing that's ever happened to me. A smile stole across Marilla's face. Well, don't cry anymore, she said. We're not going to send you away tonight. What's your name? Would you please call me Cordelia? The girl asked. Is that your name? Marilla asked with a frown. No, not exactly, the girl admitted. My real name is Anne Surly. But I like Cordelia better. It's so much more romantic than Anne. Fiddlestricks, Marilla said. Anne is a good, sensible name. Well, if you call me Anne, please spell it with an E. Annie. Anne said, it looks much better, nicer than just plain Anne. All right then, Annie spelled with an E. Can you tell us how this mistake came to be made? Marilla asked. Mrs. Spencer distinctly said you wanted a girl about 11 years old. Anne told her she kept Lily Jones for herself. Lily is 5 and she's very pretty. If I were pretty, would you keep me? No, Marilla said. We want a boy to help on the farm. A girl is no help. They sat down to supper, but Annie just nibbled at her food. I guess She's tired, Matthew said. Best put her to bed, Marilla. Marilla took Annie to a bedroom in the east gable of the house. The walls of the room were bare and white. The floor was bare too, except for a round mat in the middle. There was a high bed in one corner of the room. With a sob, Annie undressed. She put on a faded nightgown and jumped into bed. Then she pulled the covers over her head. Well, good night, Marilla said. Anne White's face and big eyes appeared over the covers. How can you call it a good night? She said. You know, it must be the very worst night I have ever had. Then she pulled the covers over her head again. Marilla went back down to the kitchen. The girl will have to be sent back to the orphanage, she told Matthew. She's a real nice little thing, Matthew said. It's a pity to send her back. She's so set on staying. Marilla stared at her brother. You don't think we ought to keep her, she said. What help would she be? We might help her, Matthew said, and should be company for you. I don't need company, Marilla answered. I'm not going to keep her. It's just as you say, of course, Matthew stood. I'm going to bed. Marilla put away the dishes and went to bed too. And upstairs in the east gables, a lonely girl cried herself to sleep.